Today we delve into a heartbreaking and disturbing case that shocked the Jacksonville community. This is the story of the murder of cherished radio host Tasheka Young and her unborn child. Bursey Armstrong, the man responsible for this devastating crime, has been sentenced to life in prison. Tasheka Young was more than just a voice on the radio. She was a beloved member of the Jacksonville community, known for her warmth, kindness, and her deep connection with listeners. Hosting the popular morning show that many of us tuned into, Tasheka's voice was a comforting presence, helping thousands of people start their day on a positive note. But just months ago, at the age of 34, her life was tragically cut short. In July 2022, Tasheka and her unborn child were murdered in her Jacksonville apartment, while her two young children, aged 1 and 3, and were left in the home.
Try to save her.
The crime shook this city to its core, leaving behind a grief-stricken community and a family in mourning. Her death left a hole in the hearts of those who knew her. Tasheka was not just a radio host. She was a mother, a friend, and an advocate for the underprivileged. Her passing was a loss not only for her family, but for the entire community of Jacksonville. The investigation into Tasheka's death unfolded quickly, revealing a deeply unsettling scene. Tasheka's mother entered the apartment and discovered her daughter, a well-known local radio DJ, lifeless on the bedroom floor, having been shot twice. Shaken by the grim sight, she promptly contacted the police. Her two young children were found nearby, unharmed but visibly shaken. In a heartbreaking moment, Tasheka's son told his grandmother and the officers, "Daddy hurt Mommy." Tasheka's mother also testified that 2 weeks before the tragedy, Armstrong had threatened Tasheka at gunpoint. She recalled receiving an unsettling text from Armstrong asking about Tasheka's whereabouts. This unexpected message, coupled with her growing sense of unease, prompted her to investigate further, leading her to uncover the grim scene. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves throughout Jacksonville, and the investigation quickly pointed to Bursey Armstrong, the father of Tasheka's two young children. Armstrong, 35, had a history of violent behavior, and witnesses placed him near the apartment on the night of the murder. Surveillance footage confirmed his presence at the scene, and physical evidence soon implicated him. As the investigation continued, detectives uncovered a troubling history of abusive behavior between Armstrong and Tasheka, with neighbors recalling frequent arguments and violent outbursts. In the hours following his arrest, Armstrong was brought into the interrogation room. Alone with the detectives, who had spent weeks piecing together the evidence against him, Armstrong appeared bewildered and insisted he had no idea why he had been brought in for questioning. Armstrong's narrative was one of denial. The detectives leaned forward, pressing Armstrong for the truth. Their demeanor was calm yet resolute, with sharp and focused questions aimed at uncovering the full story. Tasheka's cause of death was determined to be multiple gunshot wounds. When officers examined her phone, they uncovered hundreds of hostile messages exchanged between her and Bursey. Many of the messages from Bursey contained violent threats. Tasheka was not only a mother to two young children, but she was also expecting another child. This tragic loss extended beyond Tasheka herself, impacting the lives of her unborn child and her existing family. The detective, aware of this profound loss, carefully considered how to broach the subject of Tasheka's pregnancy with Bursey, observing his reaction closely. By this point, it was evident that Bursey had murdered his girlfriend and their unborn child. What had unfolded was an act of deception, a man pretending to be devastated over the loss of someone he claimed to love. Bursey failed to understand that a genuine reaction to an unexpected death would have been filled with questions about how and why it had occurred. In addition to showing little concern about how or why Tasheka died, Bursey also failed to ask about the well-being of his two young children and the unborn baby. His lack of emotional reaction to the tragic loss raised suspicions among the detectives, as any parent in such a situation would typically be desperate to know if their children were safe and how they were coping. Instead, Bursey seemed fixated on his own predicament, rarely mentioning the children, let alone expressing any concern for their emotional or physical state. His failure to inquire about them or the baby seemed to reinforce the detective's growing belief that he had no genuine remorse for the situation, further casting doubt on his sincerity.
With the jury found the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree as charged in the information.
Bursey attempted to explain away his child's statement to the police, claiming that the child had mistakenly confused a FaceTime call with his physical presence at the scene of the crime. However, the detectives were unconvinced by this explanation and pressed him further for clarification. What Bursey was trying to convey was that he was typically the only man who spent significant time with Tasheka, making him the most familiar figure in their lives. He speculated that his 3-year-old son might have witnessed a violent encounter involving another man and, in his confusion, mistakenly associated the incident with him. He claimed that, in his child's innocent mind, the face-to-face confrontation was muddled with a memory of his father. However, Bursey, overwhelmed by the mounting pressure of the interrogation, struggled to articulate his thoughts clearly. His anxious responses only added to the complexity of the situation, making it harder for the detectives to believe his version of events.
I'm not guilty of anything. I didn't do anything.
When did your soul die? What killed your soul?
My soul is alive. I didn't do anything. I'm not guilty of anything. And I know I'm not.
Scotty is. Nick is.
No, Nick's not guilty of anything. He just let me.
So far, you've been willing to
the thing about
blame on anybody and everybody.
I'm not putting any blame on anybody, but I know what I didn't do. I can't speak on what the next person did.
And then, every time you've had a chance to get out in front of something,
no, but I know a lot of people know.
Lie.
No,
and then when we come back and catch you in it,
because at the end of the day, but at the end of the day, I know that you guys we're looking for the same person, the person who murdered her, and I know that I didn't do that.
We're not looking. So,
as the hours wore on, his inability to explain himself in a coherent manner began to work against him, casting doubt on his credibility. While waiting in the interrogation room, Bursey consented to a search of his phone. About 30 minutes later, the detectives returned and confronted him with alarming evidence: a series of violent and threatening messages discovered on his device. The detectives handed Bursey a printout of the text messages exchanged between him and Tasheka, spreading the pages out in front of him. They began reading the messages aloud, one by one, their voices steady and deliberate. Each message revealed a disturbing pattern of tension, threats, and unresolved anger. As the detectives continued, the weight of the words seemed to grow heavier in the room, the silence thickening between each line as they pressed Bursey for a response. The detectives chose to escalate their accusations, hoping that the mounting pressure would finally break Bursey and lead him to confess. They pushed him harder, intensifying their tone and narrowing their questions. However, what they were unaware of, though they would soon discover, was the critical piece of evidence hidden just out of reach. Beneath the stairs in Bursey's apartment, Tasheka's pants, worn at the time of the shooting, along with the murder weapon, had been carefully concealed. This discovery would soon turn the investigation in a new direction, further implicating Bursey and shattering any remaining doubts about his involvement. After the police found Tasheka's pants and the murder weapon concealed beneath the stairs at Bursey's home, he was arrested, and the case proceeded to trial. Forensic reports also revealed the presence of Armstrong's fingerprints and DNA at the scene, leaving little room for doubt about his involvement. But more incriminating than the physical evidence was the disturbing history of abuse between Armstrong and Tasheka, a history that had been concealed from the public until now. Armstrong's jealousy and control issues had been growing over the years, and it seemed that his relationship with Tasheka had become increasingly dangerous. Despite this, Tasheka had found the strength to break free from the toxic cycle of abuse, but Armstrong, unable to accept her decision, had become more aggressive. Throughout the investigation, Armstrong was repeatedly asked and accused by detectives, but he denied having any intention to kill his girlfriend, though he had never fully confessed to the crime. In the face of overwhelming evidence, Armstrong's denials ultimately crumbled, but by then it was too late. The damage had been done, and Tasheka's death was irreversible. After a lengthy trial, lasting nearly 2 years, the case finally reached its conclusion. In August 2024, Bercy Armstrong was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, one for the death of Tasheka Young, and the other for the loss of her unborn child.
It was an act by you and for which you must be held accountable.
The judge sentenced Armstrong to life in prison for the murder of Tasheka Young and her unborn baby.
The jury's decision was not a moment of celebration, but rather a bittersweet acknowledgement of justice served. For Tasheka's family, the verdict could never replace what they had lost. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow, as justice was finally done for a woman who had been taken too soon.
It's bitter to the point that we did lose 2 lives, but it's sweet to the point that justice was served today, and we are elated that justice was served today.
Bercy Armstrong was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that would ensure he would never again be able to harm another person, but it did little to ease the pain of Tasheka's family, who would now have to live with the loss of their loved one forever. Tasheka Young's life was one of purpose and passion. She was a voice that brought people together, a mother who loved deeply, and a friend who inspired everyone she met. Her tragic death serves as a reminder of the importance of addressing domestic violence and supporting those who are vulnerable. As we remember Tasheka, we are reminded of the importance of breaking the cycle of violence. It's a call to action for all of us. We must support organizations that work tirelessly to provide resources, shelter, and guidance to victims of abuse. We must stand together to protect those who need it most and ensure that no one else suffers as Tasheka did. Feel free to share your thoughts on this case in the comments below.